Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition reigned supreme, a quiet war was brewing. Prince Edward, the Queen's youngest son, had always been considered the most diplomatic of the royal siblings. But on a crisp autumn morning in 2023, he would make a decision that would send shockwaves through the House of Windsor and challenge the very foundations of royal protocol. What started as whispered concerns about appropriate conduct at state functions would escalate into the most significant internal royal conflict since the abdication crisis. The target? Queen Camilla's extended family, whose growing presence at exclusive royal events had begun to raise eyebrows among both palace staff and senior royals alike. This is the untold story of how Prince Edward's calculated stand against what he saw as the erosion of royal standards would expose deep fractures within the monarchy, test family loyalties, and ultimately force King Charles III to choose between his wife's happiness and his brother's unwavering commitment to royal tradition. In the shadows of privilege and power, where every gesture is scrutinized and every decision carries the weight of history, one prince's courage to speak truth to power would change the royal family forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windsor Castle as Prince Edward, Earl of Wessex, walked briskly through the East Terrace garden. His usually calm demeanor showed subtle signs of tension as he gripped his morning correspondence a little too tightly. Among the stack of official papers and invitations was a guest list that would ultimately trigger one of the most significant internal confrontations the royal family had faced in decades. Edward had always prided himself on being the steady, reliable member of the royal family. While his older brothers had navigated public scandals and his sister had weathered her own storms, Edward had quietly dedicated himself to his royal duties with minimal fanfare. His work with the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme and various charitable organizations had earned him respect both within palace walls and among the British public. However, beneath his diplomatic exterior lay a deep commitment to royal protocol and tradition that few people fully understood. The document that had captured his attention was the guest list for the upcoming state banquet honoring the visiting president of France. As Edward scanned the names, his brow furrowed with increasing concern. Mixed among the usual suspects, senior politicians, diplomats, and carefully selected members of British high society, were several names that made him pause. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son from her first marriage, was listed along with his children. Laura Lopez, Camilla's daughter, appeared alongside her husband and teenage children. Even more surprising were the names of various cousins and extended family members from the Parker Bowles clan, people who had never before been considered for such prestigious royal occasions. Edward set down the guest list and walked to the tall windows overlooking the castle grounds. The weight of what he was seeing began to settle in his mind. State banquets were among the most formal and exclusive events in the royal calendar, typically reserved for heads of state, senior government officials, and individuals of exceptional achievement or importance to Britain. The careful curation of guest lists had been a hallmark of royal protocol for centuries, ensuring that these occasions maintained their dignity and significance. As he reflected on recent months, Edward realized this was not an isolated incident. At the Commonwealth Day service earlier that year, he had noticed an unusually large contingent of Parker Bowles family members seated in prominent positions. During the Easter service at St. George's Chapel, Camilla's grandchildren had been given places traditionally reserved for working members of the royal family. Even at more casual events like garden parties and charitable receptions, the presence of Camilla's extended family had become increasingly noticeable. Edward understood the delicate position Camilla held within the royal family. Her journey from controversial figure to queen consort had been carefully managed over many years, and he genuinely respected the grace with which she had handled the challenges of her role. However, he also believed deeply that the monarchy's strength lay in its adherence to established protocols and the careful maintenance of its exclusive character. The gradual expansion of royal events to include what he saw as an ever-growing circle of non-royal family members concerned him greatly. The prince's concerns went beyond mere protocol. He worried about the precedent being set and the potential impact on the monarchy's reputation. If Camilla's family could be included in state functions, what would prevent other family members from making similar requests? Where would the line be drawn, and who would be responsible for maintaining the standards that had preserved the monarchy's dignity for generations? Edward's wife, Sophie, found him in the morning room an hour later, still deep in thought. As the Countess of Wessex, she had her own perspective on royal protocol, and had often served as a sounding board for her husband's concerns about family matters. Sophie had witnessed firsthand the careful balance required to maintain royal traditions while adapting to changing times. "You look troubled," Sophie observed. settling into the chair across from him with their own cup of tea. Edward shared his concerns about the guest list, explaining his observations about the increasing presence of Camilla's family at royal events. Sophie listened carefully, understanding both the legitimacy of his concerns and the sensitive nature of the situation. They both knew that raising this issue would require exceptional diplomacy, as it touched on the personal relationships of the king and queen consort. "Perhaps it's time for a conversation with Charles," Sophie suggested gently. "These concerns are valid, and they need to be addressed before they become more problematic." Edward nodded, knowing she was right, but also understanding the complexity of approaching his brother about such a delicate matter. King Charles III had waited his entire life to assume the throne, and his relationship with Camilla had been central to his happiness for many years. Questioning decisions related to her family would require careful consideration and impeccable timing. Over the following days, Edward began to observe more closely the dynamics at royal events. During a reception for Commonwealth dignitaries, he watched as Camilla's son Tom moved easily among guests, introducing himself as the Queen's son and engaging in conversations that seemed to blur the line between family connection. At a charity gala attended by several senior royals, Laura Lopez was seated at the head table, a position typically reserved for working members of the royal family or individuals with specific relevance to the cause being celebrated. These observations reinforced Edward's growing conviction that action needed to be taken. He began to document instances where he felt protocol had been compromised, not out of any desire to create problems for Camilla personally, but from a genuine belief that the integrity of royal events was being gradually eroded. The turning point came during a private family dinner at Balmoral in late September. The gathering was meant to be a relaxed evening for immediate family members to discuss upcoming engagements and coordinate their schedules. However, Edward was surprised to learn that Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez had been included in what he understood to be a working dinner for senior royals. As the evening progressed, Edward listened as plans were discussed for various state functions, charitable events, and official visits. He noticed that Camilla's children were being consulted on matters of protocol and guest arrangements, despite having no official role within the royal household. When the conversation turned to the upcoming state visit from Japan, Tom Parker Bowles offered suggestions about cultural considerations and appropriate entertainment options. While Edward appreciated the thoughtful input, he found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the informal expansion of decision-making authority beyond the traditional boundaries of the working royal family. The monarchy's strength had always rested on clear lines of responsibility and carefully defined roles. The blurring of these boundaries, however well-intentioned, represented a significant departure from established practice. After dinner, Edward requested a private moment with his brother. They walked together through the castle's portrait gallery, surrounded by centuries of royal history. The weight of tradition seemed particularly pronounced in that setting, and Edward chose his words carefully as he began to express his concerns. "Charles, I need to discuss something with you that's been weighing on my mind," Edward began, his tone respectful but serious. "I have some concerns about recent changes in our approach to guest lists and family involvement in official functions." The king listened as Edward outlined his observations, from the expanded guest lists to the increasing presence of Parker Bowles family members at state functions. Edward was careful to emphasize that his concerns were purely procedural and had nothing to do with any personal feelings about Camilla or her family. Charles' initial response was defensive, which Edward had anticipated. The king pointed out that other royal families around the world had successfully integrated step-family members into official functions, and that modern monarchy needed to reflect contemporary family structures. He argued that Camilla's children and grandchildren were now part of the royal family by marriage and deserved appropriate recognition. However, Edward pressed his point about the importance of maintaining clear distinctions between family relationships and official royal roles. He expressed concern about the precedent being set and the potential impact on the monarchy's reputation for maintaining appropriate standards and protocols. The conversation lasted for over an hour, with both brothers presenting their perspectives thoughtfully. While they didn't reach a resolution that evening, Edward felt that he had successfully communicated his concerns and that Charles understood the seriousness of the issues being raised. In the days following their conversation, Edward began to receive subtle signals that his concerns had not been well received by all quarters. Palace staff who had previously been warm and collaborative seemed more formal in their interactions. Invitations to certain planning meetings were not forthcoming, and he sensed a general cooling in his relationship with some senior household members. Despite these early signs of resistance, Edward remained convinced that his stand was necessary for the long-term health of the monarchy. He began to consider more formal approaches to addressing his concerns, knowing that the stakes were high, but believing that the integrity of the institution he had served his entire life was worth defending. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the bonds of family loyalty, but also the fundamental principles upon which the modern monarchy operated. Edward's decision to take a stand would soon reveal deep divisions within the royal household and force difficult questions about tradition, inclusion, and the evolving nature of royal protocol in the 21st century. The October morning brought an unexpected chill to London as Prince Edward made his way through the private corridors of Buckingham Palace. His appointment with Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, had been scheduled for what palace staff euphemistically called routine coordination. But Edward knew this meeting would be anything but routine. Word of his concerns about royal protocol had clearly reached the highest levels of the royal household, and the response was swift and deliberate. Sir Clive, a seasoned diplomat who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, greeted Edward with his characteristic politeness, though there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The private secretary's office, with its mahogany panels and portraits of former monarchs, seemed to emphasize the weight of royal tradition that hung over their conversation. "Your Royal Highness, I understand you have expressed some concerns about recent guest list arrangements," Sir Clive began, his tone carefully neutral but his meaning clear. "The King has asked me to discuss these matters with you to ensure we're all working toward the same objectives." Edward recognized the diplomatic language being employed. This was not a discussion, but a gentle warning, delivered with the courteous efficiency that characterized all serious palace communications. He had expected this response, but was nevertheless struck by how quickly the royal machinery had moved to address his concerns. "I appreciate the opportunity to clarify my position," Edward replied, maintaining his composure while mentally preparing for what he suspected would be a carefully orchestrated attempt to discourage his continued involvement in protocol matters. "My concerns are based purely on maintaining the standards and traditions that have served the monarchy well for generations." Sir Clive nodded thoughtfully before opening a leather folder that contained what appeared to be detailed notes about recent royal events. "I think it might be helpful to review some specific examples," he said, his tone suggesting that this review would not necessarily support Edward's position. Over the next hour, Sir Clive systematically addressed each of Edward's concerns with well-prepared responses that demonstrated extensive consultation with other senior palace officials. When Edward mentioned the state banquet guest list, Sir Clive explained that the inclusion of Camilla's family members had been carefully considered and approved at the highest levels, with precedent found in other European monarchies that had successfully integrated step-family relationships into official functions. The private secretary presented research showing that the Danish royal family regularly included the Queen's children from her first marriage in state functions, and that the Swedish royal family had set similar precedents with blended family arrangements. He argued that the British monarchy needed to demonstrate its relevance to contemporary family structures while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. Edward listened carefully to these arguments while privately noting that each example cited involved situations where stepchildren held official titles or roles within their respective royal households. The comparison to Camilla's family, who held no official positions and had not undergone the formal training typically required for royal duties, seemed problematic to him. When Edward raised concerns about the expansion of decision-making authority to include non-working members of the royal family, Sir Clive's response revealed the depth of planning behind recent changes. He explained that Camilla's children were being consulted on certain matters because of their unique understanding of the Queen Consort's preferences and their valuable insights into modern social dynamics. "The Queen Consort values their perspective on contemporary issues," Sir Clive explained, "and their input helps ensure that royal events remain relevant and appropriately calibrated for today's audience." Edward found this explanation concerning rather than reassuring. The idea that protocol decisions were being influenced by individuals without formal training or official responsibility struck him as a departure from the careful systems of accountability that had traditionally governed royal operations. As the meeting progressed, Edward began to understand that his concerns were being treated not as legitimate questions about protocol, but as resistance to necessary modernization. Sir Clive's carefully worded responses suggested that Edward's position was seen as overly traditionalist and potentially harmful to the monarchy's efforts to remain relevant in the 21st century. The conversation took a more serious turn when Sir Clive addressed the broader implications of Edward's continued advocacy for stricter protocol enforcement. He suggested that persistent questioning of decisions already made at the highest levels could be seen as undermining the king's authority and creating unnecessary friction within the royal family. "His Majesty values your counsel and your commitment to royal traditions," Sir Clive said, his tone remaining diplomatically pleasant while delivering what was clearly a warning. "However, it's important that we all work together to support decisions once they've been made through proper channels." His concerns had been heard and considered, but continuing to press them would be seen as insubordination rather than legitimate advocacy for royal standards. The meeting was intended to secure his agreement to accept current policies and cease his efforts to change them. However, rather than discouraging Edward, this conversation strengthened his resolve. The fact that such significant palace resources had been deployed to address his concerns suggested that they were being taken seriously, even if they were being dismissed publicly. The careful preparation of counter-arguments and the involvement of the king's private secretary indicated that his observations had struck at something important. After the meeting, Edward walked through St. James's Park, needing time to process what he had learned and consider his next steps. The autumn leaves crunching beneath his feet provided a rhythmic soundtrack to his thoughts as he weighed the personal and institutional implications of continuing his advocacy. The message from the palace had been clear: cease your concerns and support the current direction. However, Edward's commitment to royal protocol ran deeper than personal comfort or family harmony. He had spent his entire adult life serving the monarchy, and he believed that service required honest assessment of policies and practices, even when such honesty was unwelcome. Over the following weeks, Edward began to notice more subtle changes in his treatment within royal circles. Invitations to certain planning meetings arrived later than usual, sometimes too late for meaningful participation. His suggestions for guest lists or protocol arrangements were acknowledged politely but rarely implemented. Most significantly, he observed that his access to information about upcoming events became more limited, requiring him to seek details that had previously been provided automatically. These changes confirmed Edward's suspicion that his concerns had created significant friction within the palace hierarchy. However, they also reinforced his belief that important issues were being suppressed rather than addressed, which only strengthened his conviction that his stand was necessary. The situation reached a new level of complexity when Edward learned that Princess Anne had been approached about his concerns. As the Princess Royal and the most protocol-conscious member of the royal family, Anne's position would carry significant weight in any internal discussion about royal standards. Anne's response, delivered through careful diplomatic channels, was characteristically direct. She shared Edward's concerns about maintaining appropriate standards but counseled patience and discretion in addressing them. Her message was clear. These issues needed to be resolved within the family rather than through formal challenges to establish policies. Edward respected his sister's perspective and understood the wisdom of her approach. However, he also recognized that informal family discussions had already proven inadequate to address the underlying issues. His conversation with Charles at Balmoral had produced no meaningful changes, and the palace's response to his concerns had been dismissive rather than substantive. The complexity of Edward's position became even more apparent when he learned that Camilla herself had been informed about his concerns. Through carefully worded palace communications, the queen consort had been briefed on his objections to her family's expanded role in royal events. Camilla's response demonstrated both grace and political acuity. Rather than expressing offense or anger, she requested a private conversation with Edward to discuss his concerns directly. Her message, delivered through Sophie, emphasized her respect for royal traditions and her desire to ensure that her family's presence at royal events enhanced rather than detracted from their significance. This development presented Edward with both an opportunity and a challenge. A direct conversation with Camilla could potentially resolve the issues through mutual understanding and compromise. However, it could also create additional complications if their discussion was unsuccessful or if their different perspectives proved irreconcilable. Edward recognized that he stood at a crucial decision point. He could accept the palace's preference that he cease raising concerns and focus on his other royal duties. Alternatively, he could continue to advocate for stricter protocol enforcement, knowing that such advocacy would likely create ongoing friction within the family and potentially impact his own position within the royal hierarchy. The weight of his decision was amplified by his awareness that this issue represented larger questions about the monarchy's future direction. The integration of Camilla's family into royal events was part of broader changes in how the institution operated, and his response would signal his attitude toward modernization more generally. As Edward prepared for his meeting with Camilla, he knew that their conversation would likely determine not only the resolution of current protocol concerns, but also his ongoing role in shaping the monarchy's adherence to traditional standards. The stakes had become much higher than guest list arrangements or seating protocols. They now encompassed fundamental questions about royal authority, family loyalty, and institutional integrity. The private sitting room at Clarence House had been carefully prepared for what palace staff knew would be one of the most delicate conversations in recent royal history. Queen Camilla arrived 15 minutes early, reviewing her notes one final time while sipping tea from a Wedgwood cup that had belonged to the Queen Mother. Her calm exterior masked the considerable anxiety she felt about the upcoming discussion with Prince Edward. knowing that the conversation would likely determine her family's future role in royal life. Edward arrived precisely on time, as was his custom, carrying a leather portfolio containing documentation he had carefully assembled over the preceding weeks. His demeanor was respectful but resolute, reflecting his determination to address his concerns directly while maintaining the courtesy appropriate for the queen consort. The initial moments of their meeting were marked by the formal politeness that characterized most royal interactions, but both participants understood that the stakes were too high for extended pleasantries. Camilla, drawing on years of experience navigating difficult royal situations, took the initiative in addressing the underlying issues. "Edward, I want you to know that I deeply appreciate your commitment to royal protocol and tradition," she began, her voice carrying genuine warmth despite the tension of the situation. "Your concerns about my family's involvement in royal events have been brought to my attention, and I believe we should discuss them openly." Edward appreciated her direct approach, which aligned with his own preference for addressing issues honestly rather than through diplomatic circumvention. "Ma'am, my concerns are based purely on maintaining the standards that have preserved the monarchy's dignity and effectiveness," he replied. "I have tremendous respect for you personally and for the grace with which you've assumed your role as queen consort." This acknowledgement seemed to ease some of the tension in the room, allowing both participants to move beyond personal defensiveness towards substantive discussion of the underlying issues. Camilla had prepared extensively for this conversation, consulting with palace historians and protocol experts to understand the precedents and principles that guided Edward's concerns.
"I understand that the inclusion of Tom and Laura in certain royal events has raised questions about appropriate boundaries,"
Camilla continued. "I want you to know that their participation has never been intended to challenge established protocols or to blur the lines between family relationships and official royal duties." Edward listened carefully as Camilla explained her perspective on her children's involvement in royal life. She described the unique challenges of blending families at the highest level of public scrutiny, where every decision was analyzed and every precedent carried lasting implications. Her explanation revealed the considerable thought that had gone into each instance of her family's participation in royal events. However, as their conversation progressed, the fundamental differences in their perspectives became increasingly apparent. Camilla viewed her children's presence at royal functions as a natural extension of family unity and support, while Edward saw it as a departure from carefully maintained boundaries between personal relationships and official responsibilities. "Tom and Laura have been incredibly supportive of my role as queen consort," Camilla explained. "Their presence at certain events provides me with the emotional support I need while also demonstrating the contemporary nature of royal family structures." Edward understood the personal importance of family support but remained concerned about the institutional implications.
"Ma'am, I don't question the value of family support.
However, I worry about the precedent being set and the potential impact on the monarchy's reputation for maintaining appropriate standards." The conversation became more challenging when they discussed specific examples of protocol concerns. Edward cited the state banquet guest list, explaining his belief that such prestigious occasions should maintain their exclusive character through careful curation of attendees. Camilla countered by describing her family's genuine appreciation for the honor of inclusion and their commitment to conducting themselves appropriately at all royal functions. Their discussion revealed a deeper philosophical difference about the monarchy's approach to modernization. Camilla believed that the institution needed to demonstrate its relevance to contemporary family structures and social norms, while Edward emphasized the importance of preserving traditional distinctions that had contributed to the monarchy's unique position in British society. As they explored these different perspectives, both participants began to recognize the legitimate concerns underlying each position. Camilla acknowledged that rapid changes in protocol could create confusion about appropriate boundaries, while Edward admitted that complete resistance to modernization might make the monarchy appear out of touch with contemporary realities. The turning point in their conversation came when Camilla made an unexpected proposal. Rather than defending current practices or dismissing Edward's concerns, she suggested developing formal guidelines that would clarify the appropriate role of non-working royal family members in official events. "Perhaps we could work together to establish clear protocols that address your concerns while still allowing for appropriate family involvement," she suggested. "Your expertise in royal protocol could be invaluable in developing guidelines that serve the institution's long-term interests." This proposal intrigued Edward because it offered a path toward addressing his concerns constructively rather than through continued opposition to current practices. The development of formal guidelines would provide the clear boundaries he believed were necessary while potentially allowing for limited family involvement under appropriate circumstances. However, Edward also recognized the political complexity of Camilla's proposal. Creating new protocols would require approval from King Charles and other senior royals, and the process itself might create additional friction within the family. Additionally, he understood that his involvement in developing such guidelines would implicitly commit him to supporting their implementation, even if the final result didn't fully address all his concerns. Their conversation continued for over 2 hours, covering not only specific protocol issues, but also broader questions about royal modernization and family dynamics. Both participants demonstrated considerable skill in navigating the complex intersection of personal relationships and institutional responsibilities that characterized royal life. As their meeting drew to a close, Camilla made one final appeal that revealed both her political sophistication and her genuine concern for family harmony. "Edward, I know that your stand on these issues comes from a place of deep commitment to the monarchy," she said. "I share that commitment, and I believe we can find solutions that honor both traditional standards and contemporary realities." Edward left Clarence's house with mixed feelings about the conversation's outcome. Camilla's proposal for developing formal guidelines offered a potential path toward resolution, but he remained concerned about whether such guidelines would adequately address his fundamental concerns about protocol enforcement. Over the following days, Edward consulted with Sophie about the implications of accepting Camilla's proposal. His wife's perspective was characteristically practical and politically astute. She recognized that collaborative development of new protocols offered the best opportunity to influence outcomes while maintaining family relationships. "You have a choice," Sophie observed during one of their evening walks around their estate. "You can continue to oppose current practices from the outside, or you can work from within to shape new approaches that better reflect your concerns." Edward understood the wisdom of her analysis, but also recognized the risks involved in either approach. Working with Camilla to develop new protocols might result in guidelines that didn't sufficiently address his concerns, but continued opposition might lead to his complete exclusion from protocol discussions. The complexity of his decision was further complicated by signals he received from other members of the royal family. Princess Anne expressed cautious support for collaborative approaches, but warned against compromising too extensively on fundamental principles. Prince William, through carefully diplomatic communications, suggested that protocol concerns needed to be balanced against the broader goal of family unity. Most significantly, Edward learned that King Charles was closely monitoring the situation and would ultimately need to approve any new protocols that emerged from discussions with Camilla. The king's position remained unclear, but palace sources suggested that he strongly favored solutions that preserved family harmony while addressing legitimate institutional concerns. As Edward weighed his options, he became increasingly aware that his decision would set important precedents for how protocol concerns were addressed within the royal family. If he accepted Camilla's collaborative approach, future disputes might be resolved through similar negotiations rather than through adherence to established precedents. However, if he continued to oppose current practices, he risked being marginalized in future protocol discussions. The stakes of Edward's decision extended beyond the immediate issues surrounding Camilla's family. His choice would signal his approach to royal modernization more generally and potentially influence how other members of the royal family address similar concerns in the future. After extensive consideration and consultation with trusted advisors, Edward decided to accept Camilla's proposal to work together on developing formal guidelines for non-working royal family members' participation in official events. This decision represented a significant shift from his initial position, but reflected his recognition that collaborative approaches might achieve better outcomes than continued opposition. However, Edward also decided to establish clear conditions for his participation in this process. He would insist on meaningful involvement in drafting guidelines, consultation with palace historians and protocol experts, and assurance that the final protocols would include enforceable standards for appropriate conduct and clear boundaries for family involvement. The stage was set for an unprecedented collaboration between Prince Edward and Queen Camilla to address one of the most sensitive issues in contemporary royal life. Their success or failure would have lasting implications not only for protocol enforcement, but also for the broader question of how the monarchy balanced traditional standards with modern family realities. The oak-paneled conference room in the private secretary's office had never hosted a more unusual royal working group. Prince Edward sat across from Queen Camilla at a polished mahogany table, surrounded by constitutional experts, palace historians, and senior household officials who had been quietly assembled to address what had become known internally as the protocol question. The November morning light filtered through tall windows as participants prepared for discussions that would fundamentally reshape how the royal family approached the inclusion of non-working members in official events. Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, opened the first formal session by outlining the mandate they had received from His Majesty. King Charles had personally approved the formation of this working group, recognizing that the issues raised by Prince Edward required systematic examination rather than ad hoc solutions. The king's directive was clear: develop comprehensive guidelines that preserved royal dignity while acknowledging contemporary family realities. His Majesty has emphasized that these guidelines should serve the long-term interests of the institution, Sir Clive explained, his tone indicating the serious attention the king was paying to this process. We have an opportunity to establish protocols that will guide royal practice for generations to come. Edward appreciated the formal structure being brought to bear on these issues, but he also understood that the real work would occur in the detailed discussions about specific situations and appropriate boundaries. The presence of distinguished constitutional experts like Professor Sarah Henderson from Oxford University and Dr. James Morrison, author of several authoritative works on royal protocol, indicated the serious academic consideration being given to these questions. Camilla had prepared extensively for these sessions, consulting with royal biographers and studying precedents from other European monarchies. Her opening remarks demonstrated both her commitment to the process and her sophisticated understanding of the constitutional principles at stake. I believe we can develop guidelines that honor royal traditions while reflecting the reality that modern families often include complex relationships, she began. The goal should be clarity and consistency rather than rigid exclusion or unrestricted inclusion. The first week of discussions focused on establishing fundamental principles that would guide specific protocol decisions. Edward argued strongly for maintaining clear distinctions between official royal duties and family relationships, emphasizing that the monarchy's effectiveness depended on public understanding of who held formal responsibilities and who participated in events purely as family members. The public needs to understand the difference between someone who represents the crown and someone who attends events as a family member, Edward explained during one heated discussion. Without clear distinctions, we risk confusing the public about the nature of royal authority and responsibility. Professor Henderson supported Edward's position by citing historical examples where blurred boundaries between official and personal roles had created constitutional complications. She referenced the abdication crisis of 1936 as an extreme example of how personal relationships could impact institutional stability when appropriate boundaries weren't maintained. However, Dr. Morrison presented counter-arguments based on successful adaptations by other European monarchies. He described how the Dutch royal family had successfully integrated step relationships into royal protocol through careful designation of roles and clear communication about each individual's status. The key is transparency and consistency, Dr. Morrison argued. If the public understands someone's role, and that role is clearly defined, family relationships need not create constitutional problems. Camilla seized on this analysis to propose a tiered system of participation that would provide clear categories for different types of involvement in royal events. Under her proposal, immediate family members of working royals could attend certain events with clearly defined roles that distinguish them from official representatives of the crown. The working group spent considerable time examining specific scenarios to test the practical application of proposed guidelines. Edward presented detailed analysis of recent events where he felt protocols had been unclear or inappropriate, while Camilla and her advisors provided context for the decisions that had been made in each case. One particularly complex discussion centered on the state banquet guest list that had initially triggered Edward's concerns. The working group examined every aspect of that event, from seating arrangements to presentation protocols, analyzing how the inclusion of Camilla's family members had affected the event's tone and significance. Edward's detailed documentation proved invaluable in these discussions, providing specific examples that illustrated his concerns about protocol erosion. However, Camilla's team presented equally detailed analysis, showing that her family members had conducted themselves appropriately and that their presence had not detracted from the event's dignity or significance. These detailed case studies revealed the complexity of making protocol decisions in real-world situations where multiple factors needed to be balanced. The working group began to appreciate that rigid rules might be less effective than flexible guidelines that could be adapted to specific circumstances while maintaining consistent principles. The most challenging discussions occurred when the group addressed the question of decision-making authority. Edward maintained that protocol decisions should remain with working members of the royal family and senior palace officials who had formal responsibility for maintaining royal standards. Camilla argued that family members who would be affected by protocol decisions should have input into the development of policies that govern their participation. This disagreement reflected deeper questions about royal governance and the balance between institutional authority and family dynamics. Professor Henderson noted that constitutional monarchies had historically struggled with similar tensions between formal authority structures and family relationships. The breakthrough in these discussions came when Dr. Will Follow the Product. Morrison proposed a consultation framework that would preserve formal decision-making authority while ensuring appropriate input from affected family members. Under this approach, protocol decisions would remain with designated officials, but consultation procedures would ensure that family perspectives were considered before final decisions were made. Edward found this framework acceptable because it maintained clear lines of authority while addressing Camilla's concerns about family input. Camilla supported the proposal because it provided a formal mechanism for ensuring that family considerations would be part of the decision-making process. However, implementing this consultation framework required detailed specification of who would be consulted, under what circumstances, and how their input would be incorporated into final decisions. The working group spent several sessions developing these procedural details, recognizing that the success of the entire system would depend on clear and consistent implementation. As the guidelines began to take shape, both Edward and Camilla recognized that they were creating something unprecedented in royal history. Never before had the monarchy attempted to codify protocols for non-working family member participation with such systematic attention to constitutional principles and practical implementation. The emerging guidelines established 3 categories of royal events with different standards for family participation. State occasions like banquets and official receptions would maintain the most restrictive standards, limiting attendance to working royals, government officials, and individuals with direct relevance to the occasion's purpose. Family celebrations and charitable events would allow broader family participation under clearly specified conditions. Private family gatherings would remain outside the scope of formal protocols entirely. Edward was satisfied with these categories because they preserved the exclusive character of the most important royal events, while allowing appropriate family involvement in less formal occasions. Camilla supported the framework because it provided clear guidance about when her family members could participate, while ensuring that such participation occurred under appropriate circumstances. The consultation framework that accompanied these categories established formal procedures for considering family input while preserving institutional decision-making authority. Protocol decisions would be made by the Lord Chamberlain's office, in consultation with the private secretary, but affected family members would have opportunities to provide input through structured consultation processes. As the working group prepared its final recommendations, both Edward and Camilla began to understand the broader implications of what they had created. These guidelines would not only address current concerns about protocol enforcement, but would also establish precedents for how the monarchy approached similar issues in the future. The success of their collaboration had surprised many palace observers, who had initially expected irreconcilable differences between Edward's traditionalist position and Camilla's modernizing approach. Instead, their willingness to engage seriously with each other's concerns had produced innovative solutions that neither could have developed independently. However, both participants also understood that the real test of their work would come with implementation. King Charles would need to approve the final guidelines, and the entire royal family would need to accept the new protocols as governing their future participation in royal events. The stage was set for the presentation of these unprecedented guidelines to the king, whose decision would determine whether this collaborative effort would successfully resolve the protocol concerns that had created such significant tension within the royal family. The king's study at Buckingham Palace had been the setting for countless momentous decisions throughout the centuries, but few had carried the personal and institutional weight of the meeting scheduled for a December morning that would determine the fate of the most comprehensive protocol reforms in modern royal history. King Charles III sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing the 47-page document that Prince Edward and Queen Camilla had presented as their joint recommendations for governing non-working royal family member participation in official events. The document represented 3 months of intensive collaboration between 2 individuals whose initial positions had seemed irreconcilable. Edward's commitment to traditional protocol enforcement and Camilla's desire for inclusive family participation had been synthesized into a framework that palace constitutional experts were calling unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, had already provided his preliminary assessment of the recommendations. His analysis praised the thoroughness of the working group's approach while noting potential implementation challenges that would require careful management. The private secretary's support was crucial because his office would bear primary responsibility for enforcing whatever protocols the king ultimately approved. Prince Edward arrived at the palace 30 minutes early, carrying additional documentation he had prepared to support the working group's recommendations. His leather briefcase contained detailed implementation timelines, cost analyses for additional administrative support, and comparative studies of protocol systems used by other European monarchies. Queen Camilla joined them precisely at the appointed time, her demeanor reflecting both confidence in their collaborative work and anxiety about the king's ultimate decision. She understood that rejection of these guidelines would likely mean a return to the informal arrangements that had created the original controversy, while approval would establish new precedents that would govern royal practice for generations. King Charles began the meeting by acknowledging the extraordinary nature of what Edward and Camilla had accomplished through their collaboration. "I must commend you both for approaching this complex issue with such dedication and mutual respect," he said, his tone indicating genuine appreciation for their efforts. "The document you've presented demonstrates remarkable thoughtfulness about both constitutional principles and practical realities." However, the king's praise was tempered by his awareness of the broader implications of implementing these reforms. Any changes to royal protocol required consideration of their impact on parliamentary relationships, public perception, and the monarchy's relationship with Commonwealth realms where similar issues might arise. "Before we discuss the specific recommendations," Charles continued, "I want to understand how you envision these guidelines being communicated to the public, and what provisions you've made for addressing situations not explicitly covered by your framework." Edward had anticipated these questions and had prepared detailed responses. He explained that the working group had consulted with the Royal Communications Office to develop messaging that would emphasize the guidelines' role in preserving royal dignity while acknowledging contemporary family realities. The public communication would emphasize continuity with royal traditions rather than departure from them, Edward explained. "We would present these guidelines as clarifications of existing principles rather than fundamental changes to royal protocol." Camilla added that their framework included provisions for regular review and updating to ensure that the guidelines remained relevant as circumstances changed. She described consultation mechanisms that would allow for modification of specific provisions while preserving the overall structural integrity of the system. The king listened carefully to their presentation before raising more challenging questions about enforcement and accountability. He particularly wanted to understand how protocol violations would be addressed and what mechanisms existed for ensuring consistent application of the new guidelines across all royal households. These questions revealed the complexity of implementing systematic protocol reforms within the decentralized structure of the modern royal family. Each senior royal maintained their own household staff, and ensuring consistent application of new guidelines would require unprecedented coordination between traditionally independent operations. Edward acknowledged these implementation challenges while arguing that the current informal system created even greater risks of inconsistency and confusion. "The absence of clear guidelines has already created situations where different households have made incompatible decisions about family participation," he pointed out. "Formal protocols, even if imperfect, provide better foundations for consistency than continued improvisation." The king's most serious concerns centered on the political implications of these reforms. He worried that systematic codification of family participation protocols might attract unwanted parliamentary attention or media speculation about internal royal family dynamics. "We must consider whether formal guidelines might create more scrutiny than informal arrangements," Charles observed. "Once we establish official protocols, every deviation from them becomes a potential source of criticism or speculation." Camilla addressed these concerns by emphasizing that the guidelines had been designed with sufficient flexibility to accommodate unusual circumstances while providing clear frameworks for routine decisions. She argued that the absence of clear protocols had already attracted negative media attention, and that transparent guidelines would actually reduce speculation about royal decision-making processes. Their discussion continued for over 3 hours, covering every aspect of the proposed guidelines from constitutional theory to practical implementation details. Both Edward and Camilla demonstrated comprehensive understanding of the issues involved and provided detailed responses to all of the king's questions and concerns. The turning point in the meeting came when Charles raised the possibility of implementing the guidelines on a trial basis before making them permanent royal policy. This approach would allow the family to test the effectiveness of the new protocols while retaining the option to modify them based on practical experience. Edward was initially reluctant to accept a trial implementation because he believed that temporary protocols might not be taken seriously by palace staff or family members. However, Camilla supported the king's suggestion, recognizing that it provided an opportunity to demonstrate the guidelines' effectiveness while addressing concerns about their potential rigidity. After extensive discussion, they agreed on an 18-month trial period during which the guidelines would be implemented and regularly reviewed. This approach would provide sufficient time to test the protocols across different types of royal events while allowing for modifications based on practical experience. The king's approval of the trial implementation represented a significant victory for both Edward and Camilla, though for different reasons. Edward had succeeded in establishing formal protocols that addressed his concerns about maintaining royal standards, while Camilla had secured recognition that her family could participate appropriately in royal events under clearly defined circumstances. However, both participants understood that the real success of their collaboration would be measured by how effectively the new protocols function in practice. The 18-month trial period would require careful monitoring and frequent consultation to ensure that the guidelines achieved their intended purposes without creating new problems. Implementation began immediately with the establishment of a protocol review committee comprised of senior palace officials, constitutional experts, and representatives from each royal household. This committee would oversee the application of the new guidelines and provide regular reports to the king about their effectiveness. The first test of the new protocols came during the planning for the Commonwealth Day service in March. Under the new guidelines, Camilla's family members could attend the service as designated family guests, with specific seating arrangements and participation protocols that clearly distinguished their roles from those of working royals. Edward monitored this implementation carefully, noting with satisfaction that the new protocols provided clear guidance for event planners while maintaining appropriate distinctions between official and family participation. Camilla was pleased that her family could attend this important service while conforming to clearly defined standards that addressed Edward's concerns about protocol enforcement. The success of the Commonwealth Day implementation encouraged both collaborators and provided valuable lessons for refining the guidelines. Small adjustments were made to seating protocols and communication procedures based on feedback from event staff and participants. Over the following months, the new protocols were successfully applied to various royal events, from state banquets to charitable receptions. Each implementation provided additional data about the guidelines' effectiveness and opportunities for fine-tuning specific provisions. The most significant test came during the planning for King Charles's first Trooping the Color as monarch. The new protocols required careful coordination between multiple royal households and precise implementation of complex participation and presentation standards. Edward and Camilla worked closely with event planners to ensure that every aspect of the ceremony conformed to the new guidelines, while maintaining the dignity and tradition associated with this important royal occasion. Their collaboration during this planning process demonstrated how effectively their partnership had evolved from initial opposition to productive cooperation. The successful implementation of the Trooping the Color protocols marked a watershed moment in the trial period. Palace staff, royal family members, and media observers all acknowledged that the event had proceeded smoothly while incorporating appropriate family participation under clearly defined standards. As the 18-month trial period drew to a close, both Edward and Camilla could point to significant achievements. They had successfully developed and implemented comprehensive protocol guidelines that addressed legitimate concerns about royal standards, while accommodating contemporary family realities. King Charles's final review of the trial implementation concluded that the new protocols had achieved their intended purposes and should be adopted as permanent royal policy. His decision marked the successful resolution of one of the most complex internal challenges the royal family had faced in recent decades. The broader implications of Edward and Camilla's collaboration extended far beyond the specific issues that had originally triggered the controversy. They had demonstrated that seemingly irreconcilable differences within the royal family could be addressed through systematic analysis and good faith negotiation. Their success also established important precedents for how the monarchy would approach similar challenges in the future. The collaborative framework they had developed provided a model for addressing complex issues that required balancing traditional principles with contemporary realities. Prince Edward's decision to take a stand on protocol concerns had ultimately achieved far more than he had initially envisioned. Rather than simply preventing what he saw as erosion of royal standards, his advocacy had led to the development of comprehensive reforms that strengthened the monarchy's approach to protocol enforcement while acknowledging legitimate needs for family inclusion. Queen Camilla's willingness to engage seriously with Edward's concerns had transformed a potentially damaging family conflict into an opportunity for institutional improvement. Her collaborative approach had secured appropriate recognition for her family while contributing to protocols that would serve the monarchy's long-term interests. The successful resolution of this controversy demonstrated the monarchy's capacity for thoughtful adaptation and internal reform. Edward and Camilla had shown that the institution could address complex challenges through systematic analysis and principled compromise, providing a foundation for continued evolution while preserving essential traditions. Their collaboration would be remembered not only for the specific protocols it produced, but also for the model it provided for resolving future challenges facing the modern monarchy. The precedent they had established would influence how the royal family approached complex issues for generations to come, ensuring that institutional integrity and family harmony could be successfully balanced through careful analysis and mutual respect.